Hello guys. Well, it's been a while, but I am back to building some armour today. And I thought where better to start than this Valentine Mark II/4 from Tamiya. Don't worry, I did not pay £42 for this kit. I got it from Hobbycraft when they had a nice deal, which was an online price match plus another 15% discount if you could find it cheaper elsewhere. And of course, basically anywhere is cheaper than Hobbycraft. So I got a price match and a 15% discount. This is one of Tamiya's newer kits, dating from 2017, and it has three options in the box. We have the desert version here that you can see on the front, and we have two versions supplied to the Soviets. I'm going to be doing none of those versions and instead adding my own camo, which you will see later in the video. Although you probably saw it from the thumbnail already, to be fair. Well, one thing is for sure, you cannot fault a Tamiya kit for its fit. So with that in mind, I won't say much as I show you the slightly shortened build sequence. And we've got those characteristic small hatches here on the engine deck, which I really like. They're a funny feature of the Valentine and similar to the feature on the Matilda II as well. You will notice that we have two different options for the wheels. So the A version here is for the British desert version and the B and C are for the two Soviet versions. I went for the A version because it's closer to the desert than it is to Russia. One of the other options we get here in the kit is the side skirts. Now these are used with version A, which is the desert version, but the reference photos I've seen of these Valentines in Malta don't have those side skirts, so I decided to leave them off. However, that left me in a slight quandary for the mudguards because we can see here on the BC versions they have this rubber mudguard, but my reference photos don't show that. They show something more akin to the metal mudguards on the desert version. However, as you can see here, Those desert versions are too tall. They hang down to meet the edge of the side skirts, so they're not really suitable either. So what I did in the end is use those versions but just hack them up a little bit to make it look a little more like my reference photo. We get two nice modern figures in the kit, a commander and a gunner, and these are far better than Tamiya's older figures, which are always a little bit chunky. The arms and the legs are generally attached already in this case, but even things like the heads are well keyed so that you get them at exactly the right angle. I'm always surprised though, this has got one British scheme, it's got two Soviet schemes, but there's only British figures supplied. Always find that an interesting choice there. Nevertheless, these figures will work well for us in our Malta scheme. I wanted to make the road wheels look a little more worn, so I took some quite rough sanding sticks and tried to make a couple of indentations and just rough edges around the rubber on them to suggest that had a bit of damage from stones and things like that. I stole this idea from Night Shift, who did it on one of his recent videos. So there we are, there is the Valentine without the side skirts and the turret. It's got this kind of weird bug look about it, hasn't it? At this stage I made up the tracks, which are Lincoln length, but I didn't attach them yet. I wanted to keep them separate for painting. I must say, because those side panels could be removed, these tracks were some of the easier Lincoln length tracks to make. In general, I'm not really a fan of Lincoln length tracks, but these were not too bad. The next step was painting, and as you probably realised from the thumbnail, I decided to paint this in that lovely Malta crazy paving disruptive brick wall camouflage scheme. You can get an idea here what it looks like from these reference photos. I know most of these are not Valentines, but it does give you an idea of how the camouflage works. Being a locally applied scheme, it seems there was no standard pattern, and therefore each vehicle would be unique. But the idea, of course, is to make the vehicle blend into the many stone walls that apparently dot the island of Malta. It took me quite a while to get around to the painting because I was recovering from surgery on my face, but once I got going I just basically bashed through the painting. So I gave everything a coat of black as an undercoat. Then I used AK Real Colours Light Stone, which was BSC number 61 I think, as the base coat. I then lightened that light stone with a small amount of Tamiya XF2 white and sprayed it down from above on certain highlighted areas to give a bit of a highlighted faded effect there. How visible that was, I'm not quite sure. It looked visible when I was airbrushing it, but once it had dried, and certainly once the next coats go on, maybe it didn't quite look as visible as I would have hoped. But, I'm working on it. After that, it was a case of applying the amazing Malta cobblestone crazed paving camo scheme. I had a few ways in mind to do this. Technically, quite a few of these vehicles would have been green and would have had the stones painted on in a stone colour, leaving the green lines behind. But also I did read that some of them would be in desert colour, light stone already, and they would have the lines added by adding the green. So either way would work, and of course logically for me it makes more sense to airbrush the stone and then add the green by hand. I suppose I could have cut some stone shapes out of some masking tape or masking sheet and stuck those on, but I think this approach was easier. The paint I'm using here is Vallejo Model Colour Olive Green. It's not a match to any British World War II colour in particular, but I think at this scale, with quite small lines, it's not a big deal. I used some references to help me, trying to make sure that I was keeping the stones and the lines an appropriate size. I feel like I started out quite well. It looks like I got smaller with the stones over the rear of the tank, but I think that's more the effect of those recessed areas. This was a very relaxing thing to do actually. I was very surprised by how calming it was. Just thinning the paint with a bit of water, putting a few strokes here and there. I was trying to make sure that the junctions weren't too square, because if you look at the reference photos, they tend to be a bit curved, and of course a lot of them would have been added by hand with a brush. I also made sure that I added the camouflage pattern on the sides of the lower hull behind the wheels, as the reference photos do show them there too. Here is the final camo scheme, and I was really happy with the way it came out. Even here on my desk, the shape of the Valentine has been broken up really well. So the next step was to paint the details. For the metallic details like the spade and the other tools, I use this Vallejo Model Colour steel. These are my favourite metal paints by far. You can brush them straight out of the bottle, but you can also airbrush them straight from the bottle too. They have a lovely finish with really fine pigments. Very happy with them. They're a bit expensive, but they do last a long time. For the non-metallic parts, I generally use some Vallejo Model Colour, thinned, as you can see here, with a small amount of water. The inside of British AFVs should be painted a white colour, so I went around the perimeter of the hatch here with white. Later I would paint the main body of that hatch brown to represent the leather padding. Once that was done, the wheels could be put in place. You'll notice I've removed the sponsons again. That's simply so that I can get in here with the weathering later on, and so that I can add the tracks nice and easily. For the pin wash, I didn't use oil paints this time. Instead I went for this panel line wash black by Ammo by Mig. This is thinned with odourless thinner, and it looks quite stark and quite dark right now, but it does dry to a slightly lighter colour. And of course, being a vehicle that operated in a hot environment, a bright environment, we should probably expect quite deep shadows anyway. You can see straight away there how it's brought out the details of those hinges. To really emphasise the shadows, I put quite a heavy build-up of this in between these hatches on the engine deck. Again, as it dries, it will look less severe. So I'm applying this panel line wash over a matte surface, but it still flows reasonably well around the details, and although it does sort of seep away from the details into that matte surface, I think for an AFV that's not a big problem. I can blend the edge nicely, and any sort of extra excess or anything just looks like a bit of dirt or grime or wear or tear on the vehicle. You can see here in particular on the turret how the panel line wash makes these details stand out. Of course, if there is any excess that I don't want, I can easily clean it up with another brush lightly dampened with odourless thinner. As you can see in the turret here, as I'm cleaning up that panel line wash, I'm dragging it in a downwards fashion, which gives the impression of subtle streaks. Once the Lincoln length tracks were built, they were given a coat of this brownish paint here, which is a combination of brown, red and NATO black. It's probably a little bit too brown, to be honest, they look quite rusted there. But to highlight the polished areas which would be in contact with the ground or the wheels, I used a regular pencil. You have to be a bit careful here because these tracks are quite delicate. With the tracks on, I think the Valentine looks pretty good. Again, I could add those sponsons now, but I'm not going to because I still need to weather those top tracks first. I did consider doing some sponge chipping to highlight areas of wear and tear, and in particular to show areas where the green camo paint might have worn away to show the stone underneath. But as I started to put the chipping on, I didn't quite like the effect it was having, so I didn't go too heavy on that at all. The same pencil I used for the tracks was used to highlight the metallic edges of the various tools. Then the next step was to dirty the tank up a little bit. I wasn't really happy with how clean it was at the moment, and although the panel line wash did a good job of highlighting the details, it didn't really make things look dirty. So I took some Abteilung 502 oil paint. This was engine grease, I believe. I thinned it quite a lot with odourless thinner, and really without too much of a plan, I started to apply it in areas where I thought dirt and grime might accumulate. Applying it with one brush and then blending it with another. The differences are quite subtle, but I think they are visible. Sometimes I used it on the edge of panels, like here on the turret. Just has that small effect of highlighting that slightly raised area between the two. The other thing I did with this oil paint, which is a trick that I learned from Night Shift, is some general splattering all over the tank. So I'm not looking here to represent in particular oil spills or fuel spills or anything like this, just splattering all over to represent general dirt and grime and break up the uniformity of the paint. The paint's quite thin here. I can always apply more later. And of course, being oil paint, if there's any big splodges I don't like or any bits I don't like, I can clean them up quite easily too. The next step was the desert weathering. This is a step that I wasn't really looking forward to, and I think this is where the model started to take a turn for the worse possibly. I didn't want to use pigments because I feel they're quite hard to control, or at least they're quite hard to remove once you've got them in the wrong place. So I went for the Africa Dust Effects from AK Interactive, which is an enamel wash, and this dry earth here from Ammo by MIG, which is also enamel and a bit thicker. You can see the difference in the colour here. I also had this box of desert ground cover from Diodump, and although it's got big rocks in it, I was able to take some of the finer dust and use that. But first of all, I used the dry earth, heavily thinned, and liberally applied all over the tracks. This is supposed to represent just general dust that's been collected, sand and so on, that's been collected in the tracks. Then I wanted to put a bit of build-up of dust and dirt and so on the vehicle itself. I figured it would gather there, maybe in the wind, maybe brought onto the vehicle by the boots of the crew and so on. So I took that dust from the desert ground cover, brushed it into place, Then use some VMS sand and ballast freeze, just a couple of tiny drops to hold it in place. This stuff is really good, it holds things really nicely, even when, as I did later, you then want to remove them. The other effect I tried was some of the dry earth put along the bottom of edges and then streaked upwards vertically using a brush dampened in thinner. This was supposed to simulate dust streaks on the side of the vehicle. I'm not quite sure how well it came out, to be honest. Once I'd left that to dry for 24 hours, I came across one of the problems I often have with this desert weathering, which is that the finished effects dry quite differently to their colour in the bottle. So as you can see here, we've got quite a lot of almost white streaks and white areas on the vehicle. That ground cover has obviously been affected somewhat by the ballast trees that I used, and is quite white. The streaks don't look brilliant either. They're not fine enough, but also the colour's not quite right either. And it just generally isn't very well tied together. Even though it's a sandy colour, it's kind of out of place on this vehicle. I did consider using some pigments to fix that, but then I decided against it and I went down to the airbrush booth instead. I used a mix of Tamiya XF57, which is buff, and XF59, which is desert yellow, in a ratio of about 10:1. Highly thinned, and I applied a dust coat quite liberally at the bottom over the wheels and the tracks, lighter over the top of the bodywork, in an attempt to blend those colours together. So that's what you'll see in the final images. Before I did that, I took this Humbrol aging powders pack, which I got at the Airfix Creators Day last year. This contains some lovely pigments, very fine, finer than ones I've used before. And I used the medium and dark rust pigments to give some colour to that exhaust. The other thing I did was download some 3D models of some British Flimses, which are the petrol and water cans used by British forces in early World War II. I loaded the models into Chitubox, which is the slicing software for my 3D printer, printed a few out. I gave most of them a desert yellow colour, but I wanted at least one red one to stand out a little bit. And of course these have the added benefit of hiding some of that excess horrible looking texture on the side of my tank. Once that was done, I applied the aforementioned dust coat, and then my model was ready for viewing. And there we go. What did you think of that, guys? Personally, I really enjoyed making the Valentine and painting the scheme, but I think I let myself down a little bit with that desert weathering. It just didn't quite manage to come together. I think I had a bit too much texture there, a bit too much sand on the upper surfaces, which was then hard to remove, and just the colours and everything just didn't quite blend. But nevertheless, I'm not terribly disappointed with it. And it's all good practice, and it's all learning things for future builds. Talking of which, I have lots coming up for you, and I know I still haven't finished the Spitfire yet. It is very high up on my list of things to do, so I'm hoping to get some work on it this weekend. And next week I'll have a quick video, hopefully, where I'll show you a preview of another diorama which I'm making. Until then, let me say a huge thank you to everyone for watching, and a special thank you to my YouTube members and Patreon supporters. Those guys have already seen some previews of my new diorama, And weekly work in progress photos is one of the benefits you can get by joining Patreon or YouTube. If you'd like to do so, there are links in the description below. But even if you don't, thank you very much for watching, it's massively appreciated. If you do want to leave a comment or a like, then please do feel free to do so. And until next time, have fun modelling.